The rope in the black water. At 3:17 in the morning on September 24, 1943, somewhere along the dark curve of the Dnieper near the Buchanan Bend, a Soviet sapper lay half-submerged against the muddy bank with a cable line wrapped around his forearm. Verify exact time and unit. The water was cold enough to steal the strength from his fingers. Not all at once. Slowly. First the fingertips, then the knuckles, then the wrist until the rope no longer felt like rope, but like a strip of iron biting into dead skin. Behind him, on the eastern bank, men waited in silence. They were not silent because they were calm. They were silent because sound carried across water. An oar knocked once against the side of a boat, and half a dozen heads turned toward it as if it had been a gunshot. Somewhere farther back, a horse coughed. A truck engine tried to idle and failed, then started again with a rough metallic shake. The smell of wet canvas, river mud, cold sweat, and oil hung low over the bank. Across the Dnieper, the German positions were mostly invisible. That made them worse. A man could hate a trench he could see. He could aim at a muzzle flash. He could curse a bunker, a hill, a line of wire. But at night the far bank was only a black wall, and from that wall came small signs of life. A flare pistol clicking open, the faint scrape of metal, a dog barking once and then going quiet. The sapper knew the order. The first line had to reach the opposite bank. Not the tanks. Not the field guns. Not the infantry in strength. A line. A wet cable pulled through darkness. Without it, the boats would drift. The current would take them sideways, scatter them, expose them, deliver one boat to a sandbar and another beneath the guns already waiting. With the line, men could pull themselves across with less noise, less waste, less blind movement. With the line, a ferry could begin. With the ferry, ammunition might cross. With ammunition, the first rifleman might survive until morning. That was how a river crossing began. Not with a grand speech. Not with a clean arrow on a map. With one man trying not to let go. On the eastern bank, an officer checked his watch under a folded greatcoat, shielding the pale dial from the far side. Beside him, infantrymen sat in boats so low in the water that their boots were already wet. Some had rifles wrapped in cloth. Some had grenades tucked inside tunics to keep the metal from clattering. One young soldier kept rubbing his thumb across the wooden stock of his rifle, not because it helped, but because his hand needed something to do. The artillery preparation had ended minutes earlier. That was supposed to be a relief. It was not. During the barrage, the world had been noise. Men could move beneath it, shout beneath it. Fear could hide inside it. But now the guns had stopped, and the silence made every man feel exposed. The river moved with a soft, heavy sound, almost patient, as if it had seen armies before and expected to see many more. Then the first flare rose. It climbed slowly, too slowly, a small white sun lifting over the western bank. Faces appeared in the boats. Helmets, oars, rifles, the wet shine of the cable in the sapper's hands. The first German machine gun opened before the flare even began to fall. The burst skipped across the water, not like in training, not in neat lines, but in quick, ugly cuts. A man in the second boat bent forward as though someone had pushed him. Another boat swung sideways. Someone whispered a curse. Someone else said nothing at all. The sapper pulled. The rope tightened. For 1 second it held. That second mattered. Because at the Dnieper, as at so many rivers on the Eastern Front, the question was not whether men were brave enough to cross. Men could always be ordered forward. The real question was whether anything could keep the crossing alive after the first boats were hit, after the first officers were killed, after the current began to move bodies and equipment together downstream. German commanders believed the river itself would help them. They believed water would slow the Red Army, divide it, expose it, and give German artillery time to turn every crossing point into a grave. That belief was not foolish. On a map, the Dnieper looked like a defensive gift. Wide in places, bordered by difficult banks, fed by tributaries, watched from higher ground. A force trying to cross it had to gather men, boats, engineers, guns, horses, trucks, and ammunition into narrow zones that could be shelled. And once the first men reached the far side, They would be isolated until heavier weapons followed. A river did what every defender wanted. It broke an attack into pieces. But what the Germans could not fully see, not in those first hours, was that the Red Army had learned to fight the river as part of the battlefield. Not simply to cross it, but to use movement itself as a weapon. The weapon was quiet. It had no engine roar, no muzzle flash, no famous silhouette. It was made of sappers, ferries, ropes, pontoons, smoke screens, guide cables, field telephones, and men going back into the same water again and again. The first burst missed the sapper. The second did not hit him either, but it cut the mud near his shoulder and threw grit into his mouth. He spat once, tasted earth and metal, and pulled again. The boat behind him moved another meter. Only another meter. In the headquarters farther east, that would not have looked like much. On a large operational map, a meter had no meaning. Arrows moved by kilometers. Fronts moved by regions. Armies moved by sectors. But at the waterline, 1 meter could decide whether 10 men reached the far bank or drifted into the fire. The cable held. The first boat moved into the black water. And behind it, more men began to push off. But the danger waiting for them was not only German fire. It was a problem buried deep inside every river crossing, one that no amount of courage could solve by itself. A bridge could win the crossing. But a bridge, if it came too late, could also arrive after the men it was meant to save were already dead. The river Germany trusted. To understand why the Dnieper mattered, it helps to imagine the German map table in September 1943. Not the clean map seen later in books. Not the neat version with arrows and dates and front lines already understood. Imagine the map as the officers saw it then. Creased, stained, crowded with pencil marks, reports arriving late, units no longer where they had been yesterday, roads clogged with retreating columns, and behind all of it, a thick blue line running across the page. The river. After Kursk, the German army in the east was no longer choosing the shape of the war in the way it once had. Could still kill. Could still counterattack. It could still turn villages, ridges, and road junctions into places of terrible cost. But the sense of movement had changed. The Red Army was pushing west, and German formations were being forced to think not only about holding ground, but about how to survive losing it. A river promised something the open steppe did not. A pause. A hard edge. A place where the attacker had to stop being an advancing mass and become a line of vulnerable men trying to get across water. This was the belief, and it had weight behind it. Rivers had always shaped war. They slowed armies long before the first machine gun existed. They forced commanders to choose crossing points, to concentrate supplies, to expose engineers, to coordinate timing. Even a shallow river could break rhythm. A wide one could break an offensive. The Dnieper was not a shallow stream. In many sectors, it was wide enough to make distance feel personal. Men could look across and understand that if they were wounded halfway over, no trench wall would catch them, no tree would hide them, no shell hole would offer cover. There was only water. Moving water. Cold water. Water that carried away rifles, crates, pontoons, and men with the same indifference. The western bank made the German hope stronger. In many areas, it rose higher than the eastern side. A defender on high ground could observe movement below. Artillery observers could mark crossing points. Machine guns could sweep approaches. Mortars could drop shells into crowded assembly areas. If bridges were destroyed, the attacker had to build new ones, and bridges were not built in private. They announced themselves. Trucks came forward. Engineers gathered. Smoke rose. Men shouted. Equipment jammed on the bank. Every part of the crossing created a target. That was why the German belief seemed reasonable. A river could turn Soviet strength into a problem. Numbers meant little if they were trapped on the wrong bank. Tanks meant little if they could not reach the bridgehead. Artillery meant little if it was still waiting behind the water while the first infantrymen were being counterattacked. The Red Army could possess strength on paper and still fail at the edge of a river. German officers had seen Soviet attacks before. They had seen courage, mass, pressure, and sacrifice. But they had also seen confusion, bad roads, overcrowded approaches, communication failures. They knew that a river crossing demanded order, and they believed that under fire, order would be difficult to maintain. They were right, but they were not right enough. By late 1943, the Red Army had become something different from the army Germany had first invaded in 1941. It was still rough in places, still capable of waste, still driven hard by commanders who often accepted losses that would have horrified other armies. But it had learned. It had learned from rivers already crossed, from disasters already paid for, from the way German counterattacks hunted weak bridgeheads before guns could arrive. Most of all, it had learned that waiting for ideal conditions was often another way of giving the enemy time. That lesson changed everything. On the German side, the river was a shield. On the Soviet side, the river became a race. The first side wanted time to harden the defense. The second wanted to deny time altogether. That was the collision at the water's edge. Not simply men against men, but two different beliefs about what a river meant. German commanders looked at the Dnieper and saw a barrier that could restore control. Soviet commanders looked at the same water and saw something more dangerous. A barrier that would become deadly if they respected it too much. This did not mean they underestimated the crossing. The officers who sent men toward the river knew the cost would be high. They knew boats would be hit. They knew bridgeheads might be crushed. They knew there would be places where men got across and no one could reach them in time. But the alternative was worse. A slow, careful crossing allowed German artillery to settle. It allowed reserves to arrive. It allowed the far bank to become organized. It gave the defender the one thing a retreating army wanted most, breathing room. So the Red Army pushed, often with whatever could float. Boats, rafts, logs, barrels, doors, improvised ferries, assault craft when available. Men swimming with rifles held above the water. Engineers guiding lines under fire. Infantry landing in places that were not always chosen because they were ideal, but because they were possible. To German observers, the first crossings could look almost reckless. Small groups landing in darkness. Men clinging to muddy shelves beneath steep banks. Riflemen without tanks. Sappers dragging cable where a proper bridge should have been. It looked like an army in a hurry because it was an army in a hurry. But hurry was not the same as panic. There was method inside the urgency. A bridgehead did not have to be large at first. It had to exist. A ferry did not have to carry everything. It had to carry something, then return, then carry something again. A rope did not defeat artillery. It shortened the time exposed to it. A pontoon bridge did not have to survive forever. It had to survive long enough. This was the part German doctrine could understand in theory but struggled to prevent in practice. The river crossing was not one event. It was a chain. Break one link and the crossing might fail. But miss one link, and the next one began before the defenders could reset. At night, a boat crossed, then another, then a guideline, then ammunition, then more infantry, then a light gun. Then engineers on the far bank working under fire to improve the landing site. Then another crossing point a few kilometers away. Then another. The river that was supposed to divide the attacker into fragments began to receive fragments that joined together on the wrong side. The German belief did not collapse immediately. It was too logical for that. The river did slow the Red Army. It did kill men. It did create chaos. Many Soviet units suffered terribly in the crossing operations. Some bridgeheads were shallow and fragile. Some divisions were worn down to a fraction of their strength. But the belief that water alone could stop the advance began to weaken. Not because the river failed to be dangerous. Because the Red Army found men whose job was to keep moving through danger before it became impossible. And those men were not always the ones remembered in the photographs. They were not the tankers who rolled across once the bridge was ready. They were not the generals whose arrows moved beyond the river. They were the men with wet sleeves, torn hands, and tools that looked too ordinary to change a campaign. Men with ropes, axes, and wet hands. The men who made the crossings possible did not look like a secret weapon. A secret weapon in the imagination should have a shape. A new aircraft. A heavy tank. A gun with a barrel long enough to cast a shadow over the battlefield. Something engineers could photograph beside a ruler. Something commanders could praise without explaining too much. The Red Army's quiet river weapon looked different. It looked like a sapper with an axe on his belt and mud up to his knees. It looked like two men carrying a plank through shellfire because one missing plank could stop a wheel, and one stopped wheel could stop the next truck, and one stopped truck could block the only approach to the river. It looked like a pontoon section hauled forward by men too tired to curse. It looked like a coil of cable, a boat with patched seams, a smoke pot, a shovel, a field telephone line running through wet grass, stepped on, repaired, broken again, repaired again. These were not glamorous objects. They did not promise victory by themselves. They required labor, repetition, nerve. They required men to remain in places other soldiers were trying to leave. The Soviet sapper had a hard reputation. He cleared mines, cut wire, opened roads, built obstacles, destroyed bridges, and then, when the direction of the war changed, built new ones under fire. He was expected to understand explosives and mud with equal seriousness. He could be sent forward before an assault, sideways during a crisis, or left behind to keep a crossing alive while everyone else moved through it. In river operations, the sappers and pontoon troops lived in the narrowest and most dangerous strip of the battlefield. The bank. The bank was not the rear. It was not the front either. It was something worse at times. A place where every movement mattered, every vehicle needed space, every wounded man needed to go somewhere, every officer wanted priority, and every German shell seemed to know that the whole operation had to squeeze through those few meters of mud. Infantrymen might cross once. Pontoon crews crossed again and again. A rifleman in the first wave faced the terror of the water and the far bank. The engineer faced the same terror, then turned around and went back into it because the next load had to move. Ammunition did not row itself. Wounded men did not carry themselves downstream to safety. Anti-tank guns did not appear by courage alone. Someone had to drag, lift, tie, guide, repair, and return. Their work was physical in a way that maps conceal. A wet rope grows heavier than a dry one. A pontoon section in mud resists men as if it has a will. A wooden boat overloaded with soldiers responds slowly. A cable under tension can tear skin open. A ferry line snagged on debris can stop the movement of an entire crossing point. A shell landing near a pontoon does not need a direct hit to damage it. Water pressure, splinters, panic, and drifting wreckage can do enough. And all of this happened in darkness, smoke, rain, frost, or under the flat gray light of dawn when aircraft could finally see. The engineer's courage was often quiet because it had to be. There was no room for grand gestures when a knot had to hold. A man tying a cable under fire did not have to feel heroic. He had to finish the knot before the next shell landed. A man pushing off a ferry did not need to believe in slogans. He needed to judge the current correctly. A man repairing a break in a field telephone line did not need to understand the whole operation. He needed the voice at the other end to come back. That is why this story belongs to ordinary men placed inside extraordinary pressure. They were not superhuman. They were often exhausted, frightened, cold, and angry. Some were skilled. Some were new. Some had learned from older men who were already dead. Some made mistakes because the battlefield did not permit perfection. But they saw things others did not. They saw that a crossing failed not only when the enemy destroyed the bridge, but when the small movements around the bridge broke down. They saw that a single approach road mattered, that a boat landing 10 meters off course could cause confusion, that a wounded man lying where a pontoon had to be dragged could stop 10 other men from moving unless someone made a hard decision quickly. They understood that a river crossing was not only engineering. It was crowd control under shellfire. It was timing under fear. It was logistics with blood on it. On the eastern bank, commanders might speak of bridgeheads. On the western bank, riflemen might speak of survival. But between those two realities stood the engineer, trying to turn one into the other. He was easy to overlook because when he succeeded, the army moved on. That was the strange fate of his work. If he failed, everyone noticed. Boats drifted. Guns stayed behind. Men died isolated on the far bank. Reports demanded explanations. If he succeeded, tanks crossed, infantry advanced, and the crossing became a line in an operational summary. The bridge did its job best when it disappeared from attention. That made the men behind it disappear too. But in September 1943, along the Dnieper, disappearing was impossible. The river was too wide, the German fire too heavy, the Soviet need too urgent. The sappers could not wait for perfect equipment or perfect orders. In many places, the problem in front of them was brutally simple. The army needed to cross before the bridge existed. And that idea on paper looked almost insane. Cross before the bridge exists. Proper bridge is a promise. Says that weight can pass. That wheels can roll. That men no longer need to trust the current. A bridge turns uncertainty into a road, and armies love roads because roads make movement predictable. But in a forced crossing, the proper bridge often comes too late. That was the hidden cruelty of rivers on the Eastern Front. The moment the first Soviet troops reached the bank, every hour became divided between two clocks. One clock belonged to the engineers. How long until boats could be organized, lines secured, pontoons assembled, approaches cleared, and guns ferried across. The other clock belonged to the Germans. How long until artillery registered the crossing, reserves arrived, aircraft appeared, and counterattacks struck the bridgehead while it was still weak. The river did not care which clock moved faster. Men did. A commander waiting for a complete bridge might preserve order, but he also gave the defender time to restore violence in an organized way. A commander who rushed the crossing might create chaos, but he could also place men on the far bank before the enemy understood the scale of the danger. The Red Army often chose the second risk. Not because it was clean, because it was sometimes the only risk that kept momentum alive. The first wave could be painfully small. A handful of boats, a few rafts, men clinging to logs or improvised floats, riflemen with ammunition packed high against their chests, sappers carrying coils of wire that became useless if soaked too deeply, scouts moving ahead to find a landing place that had looked passable from the opposite bank but became a wall of mud once they reached it. This was not the heroic crossing imagined in paintings. It was slower, more confused, more bodily. A man stepping from a boat might sink to his thigh. Another might lose his rifle in the water and spend the next 10 seconds clawing for it while shells began to land behind him. A junior officer might discover that the unit beside him had landed 200 meters away and could not be reached. A medic might crawl behind a low bank with 3 wounded men and no idea when the next boat would return. Yet if even a small group survived, the meaning of the crossing changed. The far bank was no longer only enemy ground. It was a beginning. This was the idea German defenders had to crush quickly. A small bridgehead was dangerous not because of what it was, but because of what it could become. At first, it might be no more than wet infantry holding shell holes. But if they lasted long enough, engineers could mark the landing. More boats could find them. Ammunition could arrive. Field telephones could connect them. A light anti-tank gun might be dragged across. Then mortars. Then more men. Then the bridgehead would thicken, deepen, and become harder to erase. The first men across were not expected to win the battle alone. They were expected to remain alive long enough for the crossing system to grow around them. That expectation was merciless. For the men inside it, the difference between strategy and abandonment could become hard to see. They had crossed because orders demanded it. Now they were on the far bank, sometimes with little cover, often with limited ammunition, listening for German movement in the dark and for Soviet boats behind them. One sound meant death. The other meant they had not been forgotten. Behind them, the sappers worked to make sure the second sound came. Guide ropes were pulled across where possible. Cable ferries were improvised or repaired. Boats were assigned routes. Men were told where to unload and where not to block the bank. A crossing point that looked like confusion from above might contain dozens of small decisions made by men who had no time to write anything down. Move the wounded away from the boat line. Keep ammunition dry. Do not let infantry crowd the pontoon approach. Get the next cable across. Find the officer responsible for the far bank. Tell the mortar crew to wait. Tell them again. Where is the telephone line? Who has the wire? Why has the third boat not returned? These were the sounds beneath the larger battle. Not speeches. Questions. Orders. Short, sharp fragments of human effort. The forbidden idea, cross before the bridge exists, only worked if the men behind the first wave could turn improvisation into routine quickly enough. The first boat was desperation. The 10th boat was a system beginning to form. The 50th trip, if it came, meant the river was no longer only an obstacle. It had become a dangerous road. But roads under fire do not remain open by themselves. At the Dnieper, the Germans knew what to do once they identified a crossing. They brought down artillery. They fired into the landing sites. They attacked bridgeheads before they could expand. They understood that the key was not merely killing the men already across, but cutting the connection behind them. Destroy the boats. Break the ferry line. Hit the assembly area. Kill the engineers. A bridgehead without a crossing behind it was a pocket waiting to die. So the Red Army's silent weapon had to survive its first real test, not in a manual, not in training, not on a calm riverbank behind the lines, but in the killing zone between water and fire. The boats were already moving. The flares were rising again. And now the river, which had seemed dark and empty, began to fill with men. Boats in the killing zone. The first boat did not move straight. It almost never did. The current took it as soon as it left the bank, nudging its bow downstream with a quiet strength that no man could argue with. The rowers corrected, too hard at first, and the boat turned slightly broadside before the guide line tightened. Someone hissed at them to keep low. Someone else whispered that the rope was snagged. Then the flare rose, and whispering no longer mattered. Light spread across the river. For a few seconds, everything became visible. The boat, the helmets, the oars, the white faces of men who had been invisible moments before. The cable line shining wet. The smoke lying in torn layers over the water. The far bank, darker than the sky. Then the German guns began. Machine gun fire over water has a strange sound. It is sharp at the muzzle, but by the time it reaches the men in the boat, it has become something flatter, faster, mixed with the slap of rounds hitting the surface. Bullets that miss can still terrify. They skip, ricochet, throw spray into eyes and mouths. A man feels the water jump beside him and cannot tell if he has been spared or merely not yet chosen. The first instinct is to duck. The boat punishes that instinct. Too many bodies shifting at once make it unstable. A man drops lower, another leans away, a third tries to lift his rifle above the water, and suddenly the boat is no longer a craft but a crowded argument with physics. The sapper at the line feels the change through his hands. A boat under control pulls with rhythm. A frightened boat pulls badly. It jerks. It drags. It goes slack and then tight again. If the cable slips, the boat may swing. If it swings, the machine guns have a better target. If the machine guns find it, the next boat may hesitate at the bank. And hesitation spreads quickly in the dark. This is what commanders cannot fully control once the first wave begins. Orders can place men at the river. Training can teach them what to do. Artillery can strike the far bank. Smoke can hide movement for a time. But inside the boat, under fire, every man carries his own private battle against panic. One soldier tries to make himself smaller. Another stares ahead and refuses to look at the water. A junior officer counts strokes under his breath, not because the count matters, but because it keeps his voice from shaking. A wounded man does not scream at first. He makes a short, surprised sound, almost offended, then folds forward. The man beside him tries to hold him upright because there is no room for him to fall. The boat keeps moving. It has to. Behind it, another boat leaves the bank. Then another. A shell lands short, throwing water high enough to vanish the second boat for a moment behind spray. When the spray falls, the boat is still there, but one oar is gone. On the far bank, German defenders are not faceless machines. They are men too, tired from retreat, ordered to hold, told that the river is now the line that must not break. Some of them have dug into positions that still smell of fresh earth. Some have been awake too long. They know what happens if Soviet troops establish a bridgehead. They also know that the first boats are the easiest moment to stop it. So they fire into the water. Not because every target is clear, Because the crossing itself is the target. The Red Army's silent weapon is tested here in pieces. A rope that held in the dark must hold under strain. A boat crew must return after seeing what happened to the first wave. A pontoon team must wait for the moment when waiting feels unbearable. A signal line must be repaired after a shell cuts it. A man with a lantern must hide the light and still guide the landing. The infantry reaches the far bank in fragments. One boat lands below the intended point. Men scramble out into mud and reeds, then realize the bank rises too steeply. Another boat hits a submerged obstacle and stops hard, throwing 2 men forward. A third arrives almost silently, and its men disappear into a shallow fold of ground before the Germans fully notice. The first minutes ashore are not victory. They are confusion with rifles. The men have to find cover. They have to locate each other. They have to understand where the German fire is coming from. They have to dig into wet earth with entrenching tools while their hands shake from cold and effort. A lieutenant tries to gather a squad and realizes half of it landed somewhere else. A sergeant points at a low rise and says only, "There." No speech. No explanation. There is no time for anything longer. Across the river, the eastern bank grows louder. The crossing point is now awake. Orders move through the dark. Men drag ammunition boxes forward. Engineers shout for space. Medics wait where boats can find them. Someone demands more smoke. Someone else says the smoke is drifting wrong. A horse breaks loose and has to be cut free from a harness because the cart behind it is blocking the approach. Everything depends on movement, but movement creates congestion. This is the hidden battlefield of the riverbank. Too many men too soon and the crossing chokes. Too few and the bridgehead dies. Ammunition must go forward. Wounded must come back. Empty boats must turn around. Loaded boats must push off. Engineers must work where infantry want to stand. Officers must find units that are already scattered by darkness. It is not elegant. It is not clean. But it begins to function. And that is what matters. Because the Germans are waiting for the crossing to collapse into disorder. They expect the first shock of fire, the current, and the isolation of the far bank to break the attack before it becomes a bridgehead. In some places, that expectation will prove correct. Men will be killed in the boats. Units will land in the wrong places. Crossings will fail. Small groups will be cut off. But in other places, the silent weapon keeps working. A guide line remains tight. The ferry returns. A second wave lands closer to the first. A machine gun crew gets across. A box of ammunition reaches men who were counting their last magazines. The difference between disaster and survival is not dramatic from a distance. It may be one boat, one rope, one engineer who goes back into the water when everyone can see what is happening to the boats in front of him. By dawn, the far bank is still burning. The bridgehead is not secure. The first men across are not safe. But they are there. And once men are there, German commanders face the question they hoped the river would prevent. How do you destroy a crossing that has already begun to grow? The bridgehead that should have died. A bridgehead in its first hours is a fragile thing. It can look larger on a map than it feels to the men inside it. A shaded patch on paper may be, in reality, a few hundred meters of broken ground. A strip of mud below a bank, a village edge, a clump of trees, a ravine full of wounded men, and a handful of riflemen trying to guess where the next counterattack will come from. The men in the bridgehead know the truth before anyone else. They know how thin it is. They know when ammunition is low. They know which machine gun has stopped firing because the barrel overheated or the crew is dead. They know when the unit on the left has gone quiet. They know the terrible sound of German engines somewhere beyond the smoke, not yet visible, but coming closer. On the eastern bank, commanders may receive reports in fragments. Crossing successful. Landing achieved. Enemy resistance heavy. Need ammunition. Need anti-tank guns. The language is clean because reports have to be clean. But the reality is not. The reality is a man pressing his body into wet clay while shell fragments cut leaves from the brush above him. It is a runner trying to find battalion headquarters and finding only a crater. It is a medic removing a boot and stopping because the foot inside no longer looks like a foot. The first German counterattacks often came quickly. They had to. A Soviet bridgehead allowed to live would become harder to kill by the hour. German commanders understood this perfectly. The key was to hit before the Red Army could bring over enough heavy weapons. Infantry alone could hold for a time, but infantry without anti-tank support was vulnerable. A few tanks, assault guns, or coordinated infantry attacks could crush a shallow lodgment if they arrived early enough. So the German side moved to restore the meaning of the river. Push the Soviets back into the water. Destroy the boats. Shell the crossing points. Break the connection. The first counterattack against a young bridgehead had a particular psychological force. The men on the far bank had already survived the crossing. They had already paid the price of water and fire. Some had begun to believe carefully that survival might be possible. Then the German guns shifted. The shelling did not always aim at the front line first. It hit the bank, the landing sites, the places where boats came in, the strips of mud where ammunition was piled, the waterline where engineers worked. The crossing behind the infantry was attacked as fiercely as the infantry itself because everyone understood the same fact. The bridgehead could not live if the river closed behind it. This is where the Red Army's silent weapon revealed its second nature. It was not only a way to get across. It was a way to keep returning. Under fire, boats came back. Men who had just crossed the killing zone turned around and entered it again. The ferry line was repaired. A pontoon section damaged by shellfire was replaced or patched. A landing point was shifted a short distance to avoid registered fire. Smoke was laid again. Field cables were spliced again. The crossing adapted because a fixed crossing died quickly. The work was ugly and repetitive. No one watching from far away would mistake it for a decisive moment. There was no single explosion that announced success. No one charge. No clear turning point. Just the crossing refusing to stop. A boat arrives. A box is unloaded. 2 wounded are put in. The boat returns. Another boat arrives. A machine gun is dragged out. The boat returns. A shell lands. Men scatter. The line is checked. The next boat comes anyway. That rhythm was everything. The Germans believed the river would isolate Soviet troops on the far bank. But every successful return trip weakened that belief. Isolation is not a condition created by water alone. It is created when movement stops. As long as boats, ropes, ferries, and men kept moving, the bridgehead remained connected to the army behind it. Not securely, not comfortably, but enough. The word enough belongs in this story. Enough ammunition to last another hour. Enough smoke to cover another crossing. Enough men to hold the tree line. Enough cable to replace what was cut. Enough strength in freezing hands to pull one more load. Wars are often described through overwhelming force, but bridgeheads survive through margins. Not abundance. Margins. There may be 1 anti-tank gun where 3 were needed. 1 radio still working. 1 officer still able to organize scattered squads. 1 engineer who knows where the bank is firm enough for the next landing. 1 boat crew that has not yet broken. In the bridgehead, men learn to measure hope differently. A distant engine might be German armor. A low shape on the river might be another Soviet boat. A shell landing behind them might mean the crossing point is being hit. A shout from the bank might mean ammunition has arrived. The entire battle becomes an argument between fear and evidence. And the evidence comes in small deliveries. When the first heavier weapons reach the far bank, the emotional balance changes. Not completely, not safely, but noticeably. A mortar crew digging in. A machine gun set behind a fold of ground. An anti-tank rifle or gun dragged into position. The men who survived the first hours can feel the bridgehead becoming less like a desperate landing and more like a position. The Germans can feel it too. That is the moment when the original belief begins to fracture. The river has not stopped the Red Army. The bridgehead has not died. The crossing is still under fire, still fragile, still costly, but it is alive. And an alive crossing grows. By the time German commanders fully understand that the Soviet presence on the far bank is no longer a raid or scattered accident, the river has already changed sides in the battle. It still belongs to geography. It still kills. But it no longer belongs only to the defender. The next question is no longer whether a few men can cross. The question is whether the Red Army can turn a thread across the water into a road strong enough for war. When the river became a road does not have to be paved to change a battle. It only has to carry enough. At the Dnieper, that truth emerged slowly, one crossing trip at a time. What began as boats in darkness became a pattern. What began as a pattern became flow. And once flow existed, the river no longer functioned as the Germans had hoped. The first stage was human. Men crossed with rifles, grenades, ammunition, signal wire, and fear. They dug in. They held. The second stage was survival. More ammunition came forward. Wounded men moved back. Communication improved in fragments. Officers on the far bank began to ask not only for help, but for specific help. More mortar rounds, more machine gun belts, anti-tank weapons, engineers to clear the next approach. The third stage was weight. This was where the crossing truly changed character. A bridgehead could be born from infantry, but it could not mature without weight. Guns had to cross. Vehicles had to cross. More men had to cross. Eventually, if the riverbank, equipment, and enemy fire allowed it, armor had to cross. To the Germans, this was the dangerous transformation. A few Soviet riflemen on the far bank were a crisis. Soviet guns on the far bank were a deeper problem. Soviet armor crossing the river meant the obstacle had failed in its central purpose. That failure did not happen in a single heroic moment. It happened through labor that looked almost primitive beside the scale of the campaign. Pontoons were floated into place. Sections were connected. Approaches were reinforced. Banks were cut and shaped. Damaged segments were replaced. Men cursed at mud, current, darkness, and orders that arrived at the wrong time. The pontoon bridge itself was not silent. Creaked, knocked, groaned under weight. Chains tightened. Planks shifted. Engines idled on the approach. Men shouted warnings no one could fully hear. But compared with artillery, tanks, and aircraft, its power was quiet. It did not destroy the enemy directly. It made destruction possible by carrying the tools of war across water. That was the silent weapon's secret. It did not look decisive until something decisive passed over it. A field gun rolling onto a pontoon bridge is not a dramatic image in the way a tank duel is dramatic. But for the infantry on the far bank, that gun might mean the difference between being overrun and holding until dark. A truck loaded with ammunition may not inspire songs. But the men receiving those crates understand exactly what has arrived. Time. Every crate is time. Every mortar round is time. Every cable repair is time. Every ferry trip is time. And time for a bridgehead is life. German artillery tried to take that time away. Shells landed on approaches and in the water around pontoons. Aircraft, when weather and air conditions allowed, hunted bridges and crossing points. The Luftwaffe was no longer the overwhelming force it had been earlier in the war, but even limited air attacks could be terrifying against packed banks and exposed bridgework. A bomb did not need to sink the entire crossing to create paralysis. One broken span, one burning truck, one blocked approach could turn movement into a jam. The engineers knew this. That is why repair was part of the weapon. A bridge that can be damaged is expected. A bridge that can be repaired under fire is dangerous. When a shell broke a section, men moved toward the damage instead of away from it. Not always immediately, not without fear, but because the crossing could not wait for safety. Safety was on the other side of function. Repair first, safety later if it came at all. The mathematics were brutal. A crossing point could not be judged only by whether it was hit. It had to be judged by how quickly it recovered. German fire might stop traffic for minutes. If the engineers restored movement, the bridgehead continued to breathe. If traffic stopped too long, the men on the far bank began to suffocate in tactical isolation. This was the reality German commanders began to face. The river was still wide. The banks were still difficult. Soviet losses were still heavy. But the Red Army was absorbing the cost and maintaining movement. The crossing was not elegant enough to admire, but it was stubborn enough to matter. That stubbornness changed the battlefield. A defender wants the attacker to arrive in pieces and stay in pieces. River crossings naturally create that condition. But Soviet engineers, ferrymen, and pontoon troops worked to join the pieces faster than German fire could separate them. Piece by piece, the far bank became less fragile. The line widened. The bridgehead deepened. The first defensive positions became assembly areas. The first desperate landing sites became routes. The river that had been trusted as a wall became a road under repair. This was the reversal at the heart of the story. German commanders had believed the Dnieper would force the Red Army to stop, prepare, expose itself, and bleed until the attack lost strength. What really happened was more complicated and more disturbing for them. The Red Army did bleed. It did suffer. It did expose itself. But it did not always stop. The crossing system, human, improvised, technical, and relentless, allowed Soviet pressure to continue through an obstacle that should have broken momentum. That realization often came too late. By the time the defenders saw tanks or heavier guns on the far bank, the decisive work had already been done by men they had been trying to kill in the dark. The boat crews, the cable handlers, the sappers cutting approaches, the pontoon crews repairing under shellfire. The bridgehead did not become strong because the river grew less dangerous. It became strong because enough men crossed the danger often enough to change what the river meant. But enough is a cold word. It hides numbers. It hides bodies. It hides the cost of each meter of rope and each ton ferried across the water. And to understand why this silent weapon worked, we have to look at the arithmetic behind survival. The mathematics of survival. A river crossing can be measured in meters. Width of the river. Depth near the bank. Distance from the assembly area to the water. Distance from the landing point to the first cover. Range of German machine guns. Range of mortars. Distance to the nearest road. But those measurements do not tell the whole truth. The crossing is also measured in minutes. Minutes before dawn. Minutes between artillery barrages. Minutes needed to load a boat. Minutes lost when a cable snags. Minutes before German observers correct their fire. Minutes before the first counterattack reaches the bridgehead. Minutes a wounded man can wait before blood loss decides what no medic can reverse. This is where the silent weapon becomes more than engineering. It becomes mathematics under fear. A boat that carries 10 men across once is useful. The same boat crossing repeatedly becomes a system. A guide rope that saves each boat a few minutes may appear minor, but multiplied across trips, across hours, across crossing points, it becomes the difference between a thin bridgehead and one dense enough to resist attack. What matters is not only the number, but what the number reveals. One ferry trip might carry ammunition. Another might carry a machine gun crew. Another might bring back wounded men. Another might carry sappers to the far bank to improve the landing. A single delay affects all of them. If a boat drifts downstream, the next boat may wait. If the landing is blocked by wounded men and broken equipment, unloading slows. If unloading slows, the boat returns late. If boats return late, ammunition builds up on the eastern bank while riflemen on the western bank run low. If the western bank runs low, German counterattacks become more dangerous. If the counterattack succeeds, the crossing point becomes a casualty collection zone instead of a bridgehead. The chain is unforgiving. That is why small improvements mattered. A better marked landing site, a rope line held tight, a repaired approach road, a smoke screen laid at the right moment. A field telephone connection restored before a request for ammunition became too late. None of these sounds like the center of a great battle. But river crossings are decided by things that seem small until they fail. The Red Army's engineers did not need to make the river safe. That was impossible. They needed to make it usable. There is a difference. Safe means protected. Usable means dangerous but functioning. Safe means men are not being killed. Usable means men are being killed, but movement has not stopped. That distinction is hard, and war is full of hard distinctions. A commander may accept a crossing as successful while men are still drowning. An engineer may call a bridge serviceable while shells are landing near it. A medic may send a boat forward with ammunition instead of evacuating another wounded man because the living on the far bank need bullets before the wounded on the near bank need transport. These are not clean choices. They are the arithmetic of survival. The Germans had their own calculations. They knew that if they could concentrate fire at the right moment, the crossing might fail. They knew boats were vulnerable during loading and landing. They knew pontoon bridges were weakest when traffic was heavy and repair crews were exposed. They knew a shallow bridgehead could be crushed before Soviet guns crossed. So the battle became a contest of rates. Could German fire destroy boats faster than Soviet crews could replace or reroute them? Could artillery cut the crossing faster than engineers could repair it? Could German counterattacks reach the bridgehead before Soviet anti-tank weapons arrived? Could the Red Army move enough men and ammunition before daylight made the river too visible? This is the part of war that rarely fits into simple stories. Bravery matters, but bravery does not carry a 76mm gun across a river by itself. Determination matters, but determination does not keep a ferry line from snapping. Numbers matter, but numbers trapped on the wrong bank can become helpless. Technology matters, but only if men can bring it to the place where it is needed. In a river crossing, everything depends on connection. The eastern bank is strength. The western bank is danger. The river is the gap. The silent weapon is whatever keeps the gap from becoming final. When the first anti-tank guns reached a bridgehead, the numbers changed. German armor could no longer assume it was facing only rifles and grenades. When mortars arrived, Soviet infantry could answer from cover. When more ammunition crossed, men stopped counting every burst. When engineers improved the bank, unloading accelerated. Each small change altered the survival equation. Nothing became easy, but the bridgehead became harder to kill. That was enough. For the Germans, this was maddening. They could inflict losses and still fail to erase the crossing. They could shell the bridge and see it repaired. They could counterattack one lodgment and discover another forming elsewhere. They could trust the river and still watch Soviet pressure appear on the wrong side. For the Soviet engineers, the math was not abstract. It was felt in the body. How many more loads before the arms stopped working? How many more trips before the boat took too much water? How many men could stand on a pontoon section before it shifted? How long could a man work in freezing water before he became slower than the task required? There is no glory in those calculations, only necessity. And beneath every successful crossing, beneath every report that spoke of bridgeheads established and objectives taken, lay the human cost of keeping the numbers moving. Because the river did not let the Red Army cross for free. It took payment from the men closest to the water. The men the river took. By morning, the riverbank looked different. At night, fear hides details. Darkness turns bodies into shapes, broken equipment into shadows, blood into something only felt when a hand slips. But morning takes away that mercy. The eastern bank after a crossing was not a rear area. It was a place of wreckage. Boats lay half-pulled from the water, some with holes punched through their sides, some overturned, some still tied to lines no one had time to untangle. Ammunition crates sat in mud, a few dry, others split open, cartridges scattered where men had fallen while carrying them. Oars floated near the bank. A helmet turned slowly in the current. Horses stood trembling beside carts, their coats dark with sweat and river mist. The wounded made less noise than people expect. Some called out, some cursed, some asked for water while surrounded by it. But many were quiet, not because their wounds were light, but because pain and shock had pulled them inward. A medic moving along the bank might recognize that silence and hate it. Across the river, the far bank held its own dead. Men who had survived the crossing but not the first counterattack. Men who had crawled above the landing site and been hit before digging in. Men who had reached the wrong bend in the river and died without knowing whether anyone knew where they were. Men caught between the first promise of survival and the arrival of the weapons needed to make survival real. The cost did not fall evenly. Infantrymen paid heavily in the first waves. But the engineers and boat crews paid in repetition. They were asked to return to the danger after already seeing what it did. A man rowing back through machine gun fire did not possess a different kind of body from the men crouched in the boat. He felt the same fear. He had the same instinct to stay low, stay still, stay alive. But the crossing required movement. So he moved. Some men drowned without being shot. This is easy to overlook in accounts dominated by artillery and gunfire. A loaded boat sits low. A man wearing boots, carrying a rifle, ammunition, grenades, a greatcoat, perhaps a pack, does not become graceful in water because the cause is urgent. If a boat capsized, survival depended on seconds, on whether a man could shed weight, whether someone could reach him, whether panic spread to others. Cold made everything harder. A man pulled from the river might still be alive and already losing the ability to help himself. Fingers stiffened. Muscles cramped. Speech became slow. A soldier could be saved from drowning and still be lost to exposure if no one could warm him, move him, or spare attention long enough. The river did not distinguish between courage and accident. A brave man could slip. A careful man could be hit. A strong swimmer could be dragged under by equipment. A wounded man could survive the bullet and die because no boat returned in time. This is why the human cost of crossings resists clean narration. It was not only the drama of men charging into fire. It was the slow cruelty of conditions. Mud that trapped boots. Water that soaked bandages. Smoke that hid the enemy and disoriented friends. Noise that swallowed orders. Banks so crowded that wounded men lay beside ammunition because there was nowhere else to put them. Some of the hardest choices belonged to men no documentary can easily name. A boat crew reaching the eastern bank had space for 2 wounded men, but ammunition had to go forward. A medic had to decide who could survive waiting. An engineer had to step over a body because the cable had to be repaired before the next boat drifted. An officer had to send men back into the water after seeing the last boat come in with half its crew missing. No one needed to call these choices heroic. They were too heavy for that word. They were choices made because not choosing would also kill men. On the German side, there was cost too. Defenders in the positions above the river were exhausted, under artillery fire, often short of reserves, ordered to hold ground that the larger retreat had already made unstable. Some believed the river line would give them relief. Instead, they found themselves fighting Soviet bridgeheads that appeared in darkness and refused to disappear. They too were caught inside the collapse of a belief. They had been told or had told themselves that the river would create order. It created another form of chaos. When Soviet artillery began to answer from positions closer to the far bank, when mortars opened from newly held ground, when anti-tank weapons appeared where only rifles had been expected, German soldiers understood that the crossing had entered a new phase. The first opportunity to throw the attackers back into the water had passed or was passing. That realization did not arrive as a grand revelation. It arrived in small battlefield facts. A Soviet machine gun firing from the far bank at dawn. A captured prisoner who said more troops were coming. A report that another crossing point had opened nearby. A German counterattack stopped by weapons that should not yet have been across. A bridge seen through smoke where last night there had been only water. For the Soviet men at the river, success did not feel like triumph. Not at first. It felt like exhaustion with more work inside it. The bridgehead still had to be fed. The crossing still had to be repaired. The dead still had to be moved if there was time. The wounded still waited. The river still flowed as if nothing had happened. Later, reports would speak in operational language. Bridgeheads established. Crossings forced. Enemy counterattacks repelled. Reinforcements ferried. Objectives secured. Those phrases were necessary. They were also incomplete. They did not capture the sapper with torn hands who no longer knew whether the blood on the rope was his. They did not capture the boat crew that stopped counting trips because counting made the fear worse. They did not capture the infantryman on the far bank listening for the next ferry like a man listening for a verdict. The silent weapon worked. But it worked through men. And many of those men remained at the waterline long after memory had followed the tanks west. Written in reports, forgotten in memory. Official language has a way of drying out the war. It has to. Armies cannot write every report as grief. They need categories, dates, units, results, losses, ammunition expenditure, bridge capacity, enemy resistance, objectives taken and not taken. So a river crossing becomes a sentence. Forward elements established a bridgehead. Engineer units constructed crossings under enemy fire. Enemy counterattacks were repelled. Additional forces were ferried to the western bank. Each sentence may contain a night of terror. Each word may stand over bodies. The Red Army did recognize many acts of courage during the Dnieper operations. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were awarded high honors connected to the struggle for the river and the bridgeheads, and the scale of the campaign made it one of the enormous battles of the Eastern Front. But recognition and memory are not the same thing. Memory prefers images that are easy to hold. A tank crossing a bridge. Infantry raising a flag. A commander pointing across a map. Artillery firing in lines. The engineer's work is harder to remember because it is transitional. He makes it possible for others to appear in the decisive photograph. Once the tank crosses, the bridge is background. Once the infantry advances, the ferry point is behind them. Once the city falls, the muddy bank becomes a place passed through, not a place where the battle was nearly lost. This is not because the work was unimportant. It is because successful support often vanishes into the success it creates. The Germans saw more than memory later preserved. Their reports and reactions, where available, often reveal the practical anxiety of facing Soviet bridgeheads, the urgency of counterattacks, the need to hit crossings early, the danger of allowing Soviet forces to bring over heavier weapons. They understood that a bridgehead was not defined only by its current size. It was defined by its rate of reinforcement. That is a cold phrase. Rate of reinforcement. But inside it lies the whole story. Boats moving under fire. Men unloading crates. Engineers repairing lines. A bridge section replaced before traffic collapses. A field gun dragged into position at the last possible hour. The Germans did not have to admire the system to fear its effects. A Soviet bridgehead that survived the night might be twice as dangerous by afternoon. One that survived a counterattack might become the base for another attack. A crossing that seemed chaotic might harden into something no longer possible to erase without major effort. That was the delayed realization. The silent weapon was not simply the pontoon bridge itself. It was the Red Army's growing ability to treat the river not as the end of movement, but as a phase of movement. Difficult, bloody, sometimes wasteful, often improvised, but survivable enough to continue the offensive. For Soviet commanders, the lesson was equally severe. River crossings demanded not only bravery, but coordination. Failures exposed the cost of poor preparation. Lack of bridging equipment could trap success on the wrong bank. Air attack could punish crowded crossings. Bad communication could leave units isolated. The Dnieper showed both Soviet strength and Soviet limits. That is important. A serious war story should not pretend that success means perfection. The Red Army's river crossings were not clean masterpieces performed without error. They were filled with confusion, losses, improvisation, and decisions made under pressure by men who did not always know what was happening beyond their small sector. Some operations succeeded because they were well supported. Others survived because men endured long enough for support to catch up. Some failed in places where courage could not compensate for fire, water, terrain, and time. But from those crossings came a deeper operational habit. Do not let the enemy rest behind water. Do not allow a retreating army to turn geography into recovery. Cross fast where possible. Seize bridgeheads before the defense settles. Feed them before they die. Expand them before the enemy can concentrate. Repair under fire. Move again. That habit would matter beyond the Dnieper. It would matter as the war moved west, toward rivers whose names carried their own weight. The Vistula, the Oder, and the approaches to Germany itself. Still, the men who made these crossings possible remained difficult to place in public memory. They were not absent. They were honored in units, records, medals, and veterans' accounts. But the larger imagination of war often marched past them. It followed the rifleman into the village, the tank into the city, the general into the history book. The sapper stayed near the water. Perhaps that is fitting in a cruel way. His work belonged to thresholds. Between one bank and another. Between defeat and survival. Between an isolated landing and an army advancing. Between what commanders believed a river would do and what men with wet hands made it do instead. But the story does not end at the Dnieper. A weapon that works once may be remembered as improvisation. A weapon that works again becomes doctrine. And by the time the Red Army reached the rivers farther west, the silent weapon had become part of how it moved. The doctrine of moving through water. By 1944 and 1945, rivers no longer appeared to Soviet planners as surprises. They were still dangerous, still costly, still capable of turning confidence into disaster. But they were no longer mysteries in the same way. The Red Army had paid for lessons in water, mud, cable, and blood, and those lessons moved west with it. The Vistula, the Oder, smaller rivers whose names never became famous outside military maps. Each carried the same old promise to the defender. Here, perhaps, the attacker must slow. Here, perhaps, the front can be stabilized. Here, perhaps, artillery can find the crossing points and armor can counterattack before the enemy brings over weight. The promise was never empty. Rivers remained serious obstacles until the end. A careless crossing could still fail. A bridgehead could still be crushed. Engineers could still be killed faster than they could repair what the enemy destroyed. But the German hope that water itself could restore strategic control became harder to sustain. The Red Army had learned how to move through water as part of operational momentum. That phrase can sound too clean. On the ground, it meant men arriving at riverbanks already thinking beyond the first crossing. It meant reconnaissance looking for usable banks, hidden approaches, ferry sites, damaged bridges worth repairing, and bends in the river where smoke and darkness might help. It meant engineers moving near the front, not waiting far behind until the infantry had solved the problem alone. It meant commanders trying to push forward detachments across before German defenses fully settled. It also meant accepting that the first bridgehead might be ugly, too small, too exposed, too expensive. But if it lived, it could become the hinge of the next movement. The silent weapon matured because it combined several things that rarely receive equal attention. Engineering skill, logistical pressure, tactical brutality, and institutional memory. Men learned where earlier crossings had failed. Units learned the value of speed. Commanders learned that a bridge without protection was a target, but infantry without a crossing behind them was a sacrifice. The system improved not because war became humane, but because repetition made certain mistakes harder to ignore. Still, even late in the war, the river never became easy. An engineer approaching the Oder in 1945 did not feel that history had become inevitable. He felt mud, fatigue, enemy fire, and the weight of equipment. He saw men who had survived years of war become quiet at the sight of another crossing. He understood that Germany was closer now, but closeness could make resistance sharper. A river in front of Berlin was not just terrain. It was one of the last barriers before the center of the enemy's world. The men at the waterline did not need lectures about destiny. They needed ropes, boats, smoke, planks, tools, orders clear enough to follow and flexible enough to survive contact with the bank. They needed trucks not to block the approaches. They needed infantry to move when told and wait when necessary. They needed artillery to suppress the far side. They needed medics, signalmen, drivers, and officers who understood that a crossing point was not a road until discipline made it one. That was the legacy of the Dnieper and other forced crossings. Not a single invention, but a way of thinking about obstacles. A river was not allowed to be only a line on the map. It became a task list. Find the bank. Reach the bank. Cross first. Hold something. Bring ammunition. Bring wire. Bring guns. Build or repair. Keep traffic moving. Replace what is destroyed. Do not stop unless stopping is forced. This was not romantic. It was relentless. The German army had once advanced east with its own faith in speed, shock, and operational movement. By the later years of the war, It increasingly faced an enemy that had learned to preserve momentum through conditions that should have broken it. The Red Army's river-crossing ability was one expression of that transformation. Not the only one, not the whole war, but a revealing one. Because rivers expose armies. They expose planning. They expose logistics. They expose discipline. They expose the distance between orders and reality. They expose whether an army can continue moving when terrain refuses cooperation. The Red Army's answer, at its best, was severe and practical. If the bridge is gone, build another. If there is no bridge, ferry. If there is no ferry, improvise. If the line breaks, repair it. If the first men are isolated, feed them. If the enemy thinks water gives him time, take that time away. This was the silent weapon's final form. Not an object, but a habit of refusing to let the river decide the campaign alone. And yet, when the war moved past those banks, the river returned to quiet. The pontoons were removed. The wreckage was cleared or sank deeper. The mud dried. Villages were rebuilt or not. Men who survived carried memories that did not always fit into victory parades. The water kept moving, indifferent to the fact that for a few hours or days it had been the center of the war. What remained was the passage. An army had crossed where it was supposed to stop. That is the legacy worth remembering. Not because it was clean, because it was real, and because behind every tank that rolled west over a pontoon bridge, there had first been someone in the dark making sure the line held. What the river could not hold. Return to the river before dawn. The flare has burned out now. For a moment, darkness comes back, but not completely. There is smoke drifting low over the water. Fires on both banks give the scene a dull red pulse. The cable in the sapper's hands is slick with mud and something warmer. He does not look down to see what it is. The boat behind him moves. Slowly. Too slowly. But it moves. That is the image to keep. Not the sweeping arrow on the map. Not the later report. Not the clean phrase crossing established. A man in cold water holding a line while the whole weight of an operation passes through something narrow enough to fit inside his hands. Germany had believed the river could restore order to a front that was slipping away. It was a belief with logic behind it. The Dnieper was wide. The western bank was difficult. Crossings were exposed. Soviet losses were real and terrible. The river did not fail to be dangerous. Killed men with water, fire, cold, confusion, and time. But what really happened was that the Red Army learned to deny the river the final word. Not everywhere, not perfectly, not without waste, but often enough. The silent weapon was not a miracle machine hidden in reserve. It was not a gun that made the enemy run or a tank that could not be stopped. It was quieter and more demanding than that. It was the discipline of crossing under fire, the art of making a route where no road existed, the habit of turning boats into flow, ropes into direction, pontoons into time, and time into survival. It belonged to men who rarely controlled the battle but often decided whether the battle could continue. Sappers, pontoon crews, boatmen, signalmen, drivers, medics waiting at the bank, infantrymen shivering on the far side, listening for the next crossing, junior officers trying to impose order on mud, smoke, and fear. Some were decorated. Many were not. Some lived long enough to cross other rivers. Some remained in the water, in the mud, in places later described by names too large to hold individual lives. War often remembers the moment of arrival. The city entered, the line broken, the flag raised. But before arrival there is passage. And passage is rarely glorious. It is work done at the edge of panic. It is repetition while exhausted. It is a decision to keep moving even after seeing what movement costs. On the Eastern Front, rivers were supposed to slow armies, and often they did. But slowing an army is not the same as stopping it. The difference lay in the men who kept the crossings alive after the first fire came down. They did not defeat the river. No one defeats a river. They used it, crossed it, fought through it, built over it, returned across it with wounded men, went back across it with ammunition, repaired what broke, replaced who fell. And when the tanks finally came forward, when the artillery rolled over the pontoons, when the bridgehead thickened into a new front line, their work disappeared into the movement it had created. That is the strange dignity of the silent weapon. It becomes invisible when it succeeds. But without it, the river remains a wall. They believed the river would stop the Red Army. They believed water, height, artillery, and time would break the Soviet advance into pieces and leave those pieces stranded on the far bank. But what really happened was that men with ropes, boats, pontoons, cables, and shaking hands turned the river into a passage under fire. Not safe, not clean, not without grief, but real. And in war, reality is the only argument that survives the smoke. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place shaped by this history, tell us where you are watching from. If someone in your family served, crossed a river, waited at a bridge, drove a truck, carried a rifle, repaired a line, or simply endured the war in silence, you are welcome to share their story in the comments. Warfront Archive is built for the stories that are often passed over, the quiet work, the forgotten names, and the moments when what armies believed met what the battlefield proved. Subscribe to continue hearing them.